Back When is sponsored by Seawe, the National Trust's photo printing partner. Every image captures a story. Seawe's support means the National Trust can protect our nation's memories by caring for and sharing our vast collection of historic photographs. Through our work together, we're uncovering precious and previously unseen images for everyone to enjoy. Discover our work snapshotting 200 years of history. Search online for Seawe, that's CEWE, and the National Trust.
We're interrupting the show with a special bulletin from Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes to 8 GMT, scientists at the Royal Observatory have reported observing several explosions on the planet Mars. The causes of the explosions are as yet unknown, but several satellites are thought to have been affected.
Hello everybody, thank you for attending our emergency press conference. I'm sure several of you will already have questions about the things that you've seen on social media and the several near-Earth objects making their way towards our planet.
Is that real? Guys online and in the chat? No, this is crazy. I think something's just crashed from space.
Have you ever imagined being a fly on the wall of history? Join me for an inside view of the stories of people, places, and moments that made us. I'm historian Helen Antrobus, and lean in for a tale from time back when. No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that the literary works of one author would completely change the world of science fiction. A prolific writer, a prophet to some, and a man who is said to have found no real conventional social station. H.G. Wells's stories have spanned generations and gripped audiences around the globe. The year is 1938, and one of those stories, The War of the Worlds, has just been brought to life during a radio broadcast that for many sent shivers down the spine of those listening, as they believed the Earth was being invaded by Martians. Behind it all was a world caught in the tangles of extraordinary scientific advances. A world that, for the first time, was entering into a new era of mass media and communication unseen at such a scale in the centuries that preceded. And in the middle, H.G. Wells. This is the origin story of the father of science fiction.
The Wells family are kind of, I guess you'd say lower middle class, but he describes them as servant class.
This is Mark Syson-Harvey, a curator and H.G. Wells fan and expert. We meet Mark at Uppark, the grand country house in West Sussex, where our story begins.
His mother, Sarah, had been a housemaid here at Uppark when she was young, and that's when she met Joseph, his father, who was a gardener.
The pair worked at Uppark for a number of years before leaving to care for Sarah's dying mother. It was after her passing that the Wells began their family. The youngest of 4 children, Herbert George Wells, was known affectionately as Bertie. Young Bertie grew up in a working-class family, observing the comings and goings of both his parents and the multiple jobs they held to provide a life for their children.
He talks about his mother being almost obsessed with keeping up appearances. Like, she didn't want people to know that they didn't have servants. It was her big secret that she did all the housework herself. Joseph was a sort of semi-successful cricket player as well as a gardener. He'd had a bit of a mixed career. They ran a shop together, which was a mixture of crockery and cricket goods. It was called Atlas House. It was a bit of a strange place, not particularly successful. It was a bit of an albatross, really. By the time it was sold to them, it was already not doing well. And they lived basically their life in drudgery, running this slightly odd and slightly unsuccessful shop.
An incident and childhood injury came next in the journey that would define literary history. Bertie suffered a broken leg. Bedridden and in need of entertainment, his father would bring him books from the local library to read, something which he credited in later life as the initial spark for his creativity.
Basically, all he did was read, and he got obsessed with all these ideas. He was not going to be to live his life in drudgery, as he described it. He was aspiring to something different that his parents didn't really aspire to. He's really quite dismissive about his mother in his autobiography. He says his earliest memories of her are distressed and overworked. And then he describes his father as a baffled, unsuccessful, stuck man, but had a cheerful disposition. And he says, probably I am alive today and writing this autobiography instead of being a worn-out, dismissed and already dead shop assistant because my leg was broken.
But it was a second leg injury, this time for Mr. Wells Sr., that saw Bertie and his mother Sarah return to Uppark. With the shop collapsing and a broken femur putting an end to Joseph's cricketing career, the family's little income was quickly vanishing. Sarah returned to her old employer, Lady Frances, with whom she had a good relationship and had kept in contact with. Now back in regular employment, Sarah's attention turned towards her youngest, Bertie, who she was desperate to set on the right path.
He was a difficult child. He, in fact, describes himself as a difficult child at one point. But his mother had apprenticed him to be a draper. That didn't work out. He went to a friend of the family to be a sort of teaching assistant, age 14. That didn't work out. So all these various routes she had for him weren't happening. So he describes how his mother spoke to Lady Frances and got permission for him to come and stay at Uppark temporarily while she figured out his next move. But a snowstorm actually happened while he was here, kept him here for a couple of weeks. So he sort of slotted into the below stairs life.
Beneath the main house at Uppark are the servants' quarters, a labyrinth of rooms and outbuildings connected by a series of tunnels. And it's there that Mark describes the effect that this had on a young and inquisitive mind.
Down in these tunnels would have been a sort of a hub of activity, basically. You would have had staff running back and forwards from the house to the kitchens, maybe carrying food, going to different parts of the property. And the idea was to kind of keep them out of sight, really. The aristocracy don't want to be bothered by seeing staff running around. So these tunnels allow that access without getting in the way.
It's here that Wells first became aware of the separation between the classes, and the life below stairs inspires him to write what would be his first novel, The Time Machine.
I think you can really see how the tunnels inspire Wells in The Time Machine. He talks at length in that future section about what has become of the working classes. He's incredibly unsubtle by today's standards. The time traveller who's narrating the story essentially says, I've seen what's happened to the working classes, and this is obviously because they were not given proper access to above ground, and what he'd seen in the 19th century, he's extrapolating 800,000 years in the future. The working classes have literally become this underground race.
Published in 1895, The Time Machine was Wells's first novel, and it was the first novel to introduce that now classic sci-fi trope, the idea of a device that can travel through time. The story was a huge success and helped to rescue Wells from poverty and started his prolific literary career. The Time Machine was the first of, as he called them, his scientific romances, which helped pave the way for science fiction in the 20th century and beyond, and kick-started a Victorian craze along the way.
At the time H.G. Wells started writing, he was one of the few people who were essentially generating a new literary genre.
This is Sophie Wilkinson, a writer with a passion for Victorian literature and science fiction.
A couple of popular genres in Victorian times were ghost stories, stories of supernatural, and then also you've got really sort of gritty realism. We're talking Charles Dickens, that sort of thing. What is now known as science fiction kind of fell somewhere between that. And I think it was just the right moment for it, really. There was a huge upsurge in interest in science and technology, belief in progress, and the kind of mass production printing and the railway meant that all these kind of ideas were readily available to a lot of people. Things like scientific ideas, they weren't just the pursuit of a few privileged gentlemen. Anyone could get their hands on it. So that creates, I guess, a time when things like this can be explored in literature.
The Victorian era ushered in new ways for people to live and experience the world around them. Suddenly, ordinary people were starting to have access to all of the things that we find fascinating and that fill us with excitement. The timing of Wells's work meant that, for the first time, people could start to contextualise the world around them.
H.G. Wells, he got a lot of critical acclaim and sort of commercial success in his time. I think crucially because he was a fantastic storyteller. He talks of ordinary things, but with extraordinary happenings. So he writes about things that people reading would understand, but he sort of adds these kind of absolutely fantastic ideas and runs with them.
Many of the concepts that seem so commonplace today, such as time travel and space exploration, were first coined by Wells in his novels. And while time travel is still yet to make an appearance, there are some other things from our future that Wells predicted.
Wells didn't sort of think of the future as something unknowable. He predicted all kinds of other technologies and advancements that did actually come to pass. So one of them is automatic doors. There's also genetic engineering, wireless communication. He had an idea for a world knowledge bank, which is essentially Wikipedia and the internet. He coined the term atomic bomb in 1914, and he was influential in kind of future space travel developments. The first liquid-fueled rocket launched in 1926 by Robert H. Goddard, and he was inspired by reading War of the Worlds as a teenager and wrote to H.G. Wells saying that, his scientific path was paved by reading H.G. Wells and feeling inspired by that.
Not just impacting the worlds of science fiction and science fact, many of H.G. Wells's stories also included social commentary, similar to class division portrayed in the upper and lower worlds of The Time Machine, that had been inspired by his time at Uppark. Wells was a staunch socialist, and he used his writings to try and help turn the world into a more equal place.
There's some lovely quotes from his peers about his writing. So Conrad called H.G. Wells the realist of the fantastic, and Bertrand Russell said that Wells helped make socialism respectable in England. And I think, as well as kind of his impact at the time, you've got to look at sort of his lasting impact. So on science fiction as a genre, he is known as the father of science fiction. He was the one who coined these ideas like time travel and that sort of thing, but also his impact on socialism and socialist thought. In the 1940s, George Orwell said that thinking people who were born about the beginning of this century were, in some sense, Wells's own creation. And you just get the sense he's this highly imaginative and really provocative thinker. His literature and his non-fiction writing, it made people think, it made people question things. And I think, that legacy is, you can still see that today.
It's fair to say that what had started at Uppark has had a profound effect on the world and a whole genre of writing. But for Wells, the tunnels had another, somewhat of a kinky kickstart. to another side of his life.
One sort of surprising story that happens in the tunnels is essentially what he describes as his sexual awakening. After a Christmas party, he had spent most of the whole party dancing with this maid Mary. He doesn't know her last name, never did. His mother did her best to stop him dancing with Mary the whole night, but they were not having it. Next morning, he's walking through the tunnels. Out jumps Mary, gives him a big kiss and disappears. And he describes basically in his autobiography that this is the moment he becomes quite excited by sex. It's just a kiss with a housemaid, but it leads to quite a colourful life.
He was married twice, but he had a number of long-term relationships aside from those marriages and many, many other brief affairs.
Wells was an advocate for free love, a radical movement that was beginning to gain popularity in the hedonistic world of the late Victorian era.
Essentially, he believed in free love and he practiced it tirelessly. He was known as a prophet of sexual revolution and certainly a scoundrel. But I suppose there is another side to this in that he always claimed, and admittedly, we don't have his wife's voice on this, but he claimed that it was with his wife's consent that he had these affairs and that he believed in this kind of utopian future. He wanted women to have sexual freedom as much as men.
With his rise in popularity, Wells achieved a sense of early celebrity and had become a bit of a sex symbol.
H.G. Wells's lovers included novelists like Dorothy Richardson, Rebecca West, fellow Fabians such as Amber Reeves. Some of those went on to give birth to some of his children. American journalists, birth control activists. He described himself as the Don Juan among the intelligentsia in his biography. That is obviously his own words, so, we'll take that with a pinch of salt. But he was certainly gossiped about within literary and socialist circles. They were relatively small circles, I think, in many ways. They all knew each other. They would have known each other's business. It did get him into some trouble.
And it's this reputation that got the better of him one day in 1908 with a scandal involving a teenage mistress and daughter of fellow author E. Nesbit.
One affair was with a woman called Rosamond Bland, who was, at the time, 19. She was secretary for a branch of the Fabian Society and also the secretly adopted daughter of Hubert and Edith Bland, and now Edith Bland is better known as E. Nesbit. Rosamond and H.G. Wells had an affair. They were intercepted by Hubert Bland at Paddington train station en route to essentially a dirty weekend in Paris. And Hubert punched Wells in the face repeatedly and dragged his errant daughter home. So, yes, a lot of fuel for gossip among certain circles.
Wells's legacy is one that has shaped the modern day and continues to do so by inspiring new novelists or adaptations of his works. There is one final story, inspired by his time at Uppark, that has become a Hollywood blockbuster multiple times over, become a West End musical, and has become the central, tantalising idea in our own search for extraterrestrial life. The War of the Worlds was the story behind the 1938 radio broadcast at the start of this episode, for which we made our own Wells-inspired adaptation. That was made possible by a chance finding in an attic room.
He talks in his autobiography about enjoying walking around outside, and it's one particular day where the weather is bad and he says he can't enjoy the park, that he goes exploring in the attic rooms near his bedroom. So his bedroom's sort of tucked away in the attic, and he finds this room that he says is basically full of junk. And what he starts to explore in there. So he finds a box and finds a telescope that he figures out how to put together and starts spending his nights looking out, becoming obsessed with the stars. Where Uppark is situated, we're right on the top of the hill. You can just imagine looking out the window at night time. It must be a spectacular view. And he talks in the autobiography about his mother sort of coming in the middle of the night and essentially saying, "What on earth are you doing? Why aren't you asleep?" But he's captivated by the stars and beginning that obsession with science that will dominate his life and career as well as his writing.
Wells died on the 13th of August 1946, leaving deep and lasting impressions on this mortal plane. But best summarised in his obituary by longtime friend George Bernard Shaw, who wrote, "H.G. was not a gentleman. Nobody understood better than he what gentry means, but he could not, or would not, act the part. No conventional social station fitted him. Nothing could abate his likeableness. There is no end of the things I might say about him, had I had space or time." So the next time you're watching the latest sci-fi thriller, or gazing up at the stars and planets above, imagine how different that could have been if it hadn't have been for a young lad with a broken leg, a series of subterranean tunnels, or a worldview dreaming of the future. Thank you for listening to this episode of Back When. Be the first to hear new stories by following us on your podcast app. And don't forget to join in with the episode by leaving a comment or sending us a message. All of the details can be found in our episode show notes. Please be sure to check out more podcasts from the National Trust, including our brand new nature show, Wild Tales. Join Rosie Holdsworth in exploring the weird and wonderful world around us as we get caught in the webs of spiders' love lives, go on the hunt for elusive leaping sharks, and much more. Join us again next time for more tales from time back when. This podcast is sponsored by Siwi, Europe's leading photo printing company. Every image you capture tells a story. Discover ideas for curating and creating your special memories and unique gifts for loved ones. From high-quality, personalised photo books to wall art made from your favourite photos. Head to Siwi, that's cewe.co.uk, and start creating your story.